The coffin was already in the granary, laid across two sawhorses, when the spring sun broke clear of the Kansas horizon for the first time in 17 weeks. A pregnant woman in her last month walked east of the soddy with a newborn on her chest and two small children gripping the brass thimble pocket of her apron. She walked with her head bent against a wind that no longer cut, and she counted the frozen carcasses of long-horned cattle as she passed them. There were 41 between her own threshold stone and the section line of her father's home claim. She did not stop until she came to the rim of the half-mile draw, and there she stopped, and she lifted her face to the soft blue Kansas sky, and she called once into the empty air the name of a man who would not answer. This was Margaretha Wiebe of the Gnadenau colony, Marion County, Kansas, in the spring of the year of 1887. The man whose name she had called was her husband, Heinrich Wiebe, 38 years of age, born in the steppe village of Schoenfeld in the Molotschna colony of South Russia, and brought to the Kansas prairie in the immigrant year 1874 with his father Jakob and his older brother Bernhard. He had been a farmer of 160 acres, a Mennonite of the Krimmer Brethren, a quiet man with a quiet faith. He had laid his fields in winter wheat, and his stock pens in Berkshire hogs and a single milch cow. He had built his first soddy with his own hands in the year he came of age. He had married Margaretha Toews of the Gnadenau settlement in the spring of 1880, and they had laid their first daughter Sarah in the dry red prairie soil in the autumn of 1881, and they had welcomed Susanna a year later and Johann 2 years after that. He was a man much loved. He was now 19 days into his rest. The fever that had taken him on the second night of February had not let him go. This will be the story of the season the cold took him. The Mennonites of Marion County had come out of South Russia in the Great Migration of 1874, when Tsar Alexander broke the privilegium that had kept them at peace on the steppes for 90 years and called their young men to the Russian army. The colony at Gnadenau was the southernmost of the Marion County settlements, a square of black prairie soil 7 miles south of Hillsboro, broken into half-section homesteads by the Santa Fe land agent in the year of the migration. The colony had built a meeting house of squared cottonwood logs with a clay tile roof brought all the way from Crimea, and a school of sod brick, and a steam grist mill on the bank of Cottonwood Creek. By 1886, the Gnadenau congregation numbered 417 souls, and the harvest of turkey red winter wheat fed the millers of Hutchinson and the breadbasket trade of Wichita. The Mennonites prospered. Heinrich Wiebe of the eastern quarter section was not among the prosperous. His soddy was the smallest in the colony, and his pasture was the worst, and his herd was the smallest. This was not for want of work. It was because in the autumn of 1882, when his father Jakob's heart had failed in the dry harvest, the two brothers Heinrich and Bernhard had quarreled at the threshing board over the dividing of the home claim. Bernhard, the elder by 7 years, had taken the fenced black bottom land and the fine windbreak of mulberry and Russian olive. Heinrich, the younger, had taken the bare clay rise above the slough, where no windbreak could grow, and the well had to be sunk to 114 feet before the bucket came up wet. The brothers had not spoken since the harvest of 1882. 4 years of silence between two soddies that stood within sight of each other across the South Fork of Cottonwood Creek. Heinrich worked the bare rise alone. He worked it well. He worked it proudly. Margaretha Wiebe was 28 of age in the autumn of 1886. She was a thin, black-haired woman of the Toews line, the daughter of Cornelius Toews of the Gnadenau elders and the late Susanna Toews Quiring of the Crimean village of Annefeld. Her mother had passed of the typhus in the second winter on the prairie. Margaretha had been 12. Her mother had left her one inheritance, a small, worn brass thimble of the South Russian pattern, smoothed to a soft sheen by 30 years of needlework. Margaretha kept the thimble in the inside pocket of her cream homespun apron, and she sewed with it every evening by the light of the kerosene lamp. In August 1886, Margaretha was carrying her fourth child. She was fitter than she had been in either of the previous two pregnancies. The baby was due in the third week of February, the midwife Katharina Penner had said. Margaretha had laid in a cradle of bent pine and a small linen quilt of her own embroidering. Susanna, 6 years old, made a wreath of dried Russian olive berries above the cradle. Johann, 4 years old, brought his great-grandfather's tin cup from Russia and set it on the cradle rim for the baby to use one day. Heinrich was patching the soddy roof with fresh sod and a coat of liquid clay against the coming winter. A teamster came up the South Trace from the Arkansas in the 9th week of the harvest, leading a thin bay mare and a broken Studebaker farm wagon with a snapped axle. Heinrich gave him a bowl of barley soup and a place in the lean-to beside the milch cow. The teamster spoke broken English and worse German. He said he had come up from the Cherokee Strip. He said the cattle on the open range south of the Kansas line were beginning to go down already, the steers thin from the dry summer and the autumn rains turning every coulee to ice. He said, "There is no firewood between here and the Arkansas River. There is no firewood for 200 miles. Heinrich did not answer the teamster. He fed him a second bowl in the morning. The teamster left at dawn, leading the thin bay mare south. Heinrich watched him go and stood a long while at the threshold. Then he walked the half-mile to the steam grist mill at Gnadenau village and spoke with old Cornelius Toews, his wife's father, the Gnadenau elder of 62 years. Cornelius Toews remembered the famine winter of 1860 on the Crimean steppe, when the wood trade out of the Black Sea ports had failed, and the Mennonite villages of Molotschna had survived only by burning the dried hay of the previous summer, twisted hard into knots, and the dried chips of the steppe cattle. He had brought the pattern of the steppe hay burner stove with him in 1874 in a folded sheet of foolscap tucked behind his Gesangbuch. He gave Heinrich the pattern that afternoon. They walked together to the smithy of Heinrich Penner, the elder, in Hillsboro, 4 miles north along the cottonwood, and they laid out the work for 2 days at the forge. The stove was a magazine of pressed sheet steel 2 feet tall and 10 inches across, fed by a hopper from the top, with a draft regulator at the lower foot, and a galvanized stovepipe rising clean up through a fire clay collar. The hopper would hold 3 measures of dried buffalo chips, or a like measure of hay knots twisted to the thickness of a man's wrist. Heinrich and Cornelius worked at the smithy in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of October. Pastor Wilhelm Ediger of the Mennonite Brethren congregation came by twice and offered his help. Bernhard Wiebe, Heinrich's elder brother, rode the 4 miles to the smithy on the 2nd day, looked at the half-finished stove from the door, said no word, and rode away. Heinrich set the stove on a small stone hearth pad in the south corner of his soddy in the last week of October. He laid in 11 cords of buffalo chips dried on the lee side of the lean-to, and a like quantity of hay knots twisted from the second cutting of timothy. He banked the chips in a low brick crib against the south wall. Margaretha sat at the pine kitchen table on the night of the 2nd of November, sewing a flannel cap for the unborn child by the kerosene lamp. The brass thimble was on her right thumb. Heinrich was at the table opposite her, oiling the iron tinderbox that had belonged to his father Jakob, brought out of the steppe village of Schönfeld in 1874. The children slept in the south corner under 3 quilts. The new stove ticked softly against the south wall. Margaretha said, "Heinrich." Heinrich said, "I hear you." Margaretha said, "Your brother lives 2 miles east of us." Heinrich said, "I know where my brother lives." Margaretha said, "We have 11 cords of chips and a little hay. Bernhard has a 4-cord rick of cottonwood and a 2-cord rick of mulberry from his windbreak. If the stove does not hold, we cannot walk 2 miles in a January storm with the children." Heinrich said, "The stove will hold." Margaretha set down the flannel cap. She set down the small brass thimble on the table between them, and the brass caught the kerosene lamp. She said, "Heinrich, my mother gave me this thimble before the typhus took her. She said to me, when I was a child, that pride is the cold that takes a man. She said the man who will not ask for a cup of water from his neighbor is the same man who will let his children sleep in the snow rather than open the door of the rich. She told me this in the very room where she lay sick, and I have not forgotten." Heinrich did not look up from the iron tinderbox. Margaretha said, "Heinrich, your brother is your brother." Heinrich said, "My brother took the windbreak." Margaretha said, "Your brother is still your brother." Heinrich was silent. He oiled the iron tinderbox with a small square of soft chamois leather. After a long while, he closed the lid of the tinderbox and laid it flat on the table beside the brass thimble, and the 2 small things sat there in the lamplight side by side. Margaretha picked up the brass thimble. She slipped it back on her thumb. She picked up the flannel cap. She did not speak again that evening. Heinrich rose, banked the stove with a fresh load of chips, and went to bed. The first storm of the Great Freeze of 1886 came on the morning of the 11th of November. The wind came down out of the Dakotas in the night, and by sunrise the porch thermometer read 12 below zero, and by midday the wind chill on the open prairie was reckoned at 30 below. Heinrich stoked the hay burner stove with a fresh load of chips at 4 in the morning, again at 8, and again at noon. The soddy held at 60 degrees at the floor. The frost on the inside of the small south window was the thickness of a fingernail and no more. Margaretha kneaded a bread of the wheat she had ground on the small kitchen mill, and the warmth of the soddy rose around the low iron oven, and the children stirred from their 3 quilts and crawled close to the stove. Susanna brought her small wooden horse, the one Heinrich had whittled for her in the harvest of 1885 from a knot of post oak, painted white with milk paint, named in Plautich the Schimmel. Johann brought the tin cup of his great-grandfather. They sat on the warm puncheon floor close to the stove, and Susanna danced her schimmel along the rim of the hearth pad. Heinrich watched her from the kitchen table, and Margaretha watched him watch her. Heinrich had not smiled in many weeks. He smiled now. Margaretha smiled also. Old Cornelius Toews had come over from the home claim 1.5 miles north and was thawing his beard at the stove. Cornelius said in the soft Plautiech of Annefeld, "Good aft, Jung." "Good evening, child." Susanna said good aft, Opa. Cornelius reached into the side pocket of his greatcoat and brought out a small honey cake the size of a child's palm, wrapped in waxed paper, and broke it in half for the 2 children. The 4 of them sang then a hymn, the second hymn of the Mennonite Gesangbuch, Wenn ich, o Schöpfer, deine Macht. Cornelius lead in his old steppe baritone, and Margaretha sang the alto, and Heinrich sang the bass, and Susanna and Johann hummed the air. The stove glowed warm orange. The wind howled outside. The soddy held. Christmas Eve came at the end of the 3rd week of the storms. The storms had come every 5 days since the first one. Each one had held the soddy at plus 55 to plus 60 at the floor, and had used between 1 and 2 cords of chips. Heinrich had reckoned his stockpile against the calendar and judged that he had fuel enough to the 2nd of March. He had not asked Bernhard for so much as a stick. Margaretha lit the small tallow candle on the kitchen table on the eve of the Lord's birth. She set out the linen runner that had been her mother's. She set out the wooden bowls of barley soup with the last of the dried apples. The children sang the Plaudietsch carol of the manger. Cornelius sang the ancient Russian Mennonite Christmas hymn. Heinrich read aloud the 2nd chapter of the Lucas Evangelium from the leather-bound family Bible his father had brought from Schoenfeld in 1874. The brass thimble caught the candle flame. The Schimmel stood on the windowsill watching the stars. The great cold of January 1887 came on the morning of the 9th of January. The Pacific high pressure broke against the Rocky Mountain wall and slid south across the open plains. The porch thermometer at the home claim of Cornelius Toews, the only proper instrument in the colony, fell to 18 below zero in the dawn. By sunset on the 10th of January, it stood at 31 below. By the morning of the 11th, it read 42 below, and the wind on the open prairie was from the north at the strength of a small gale. The chimney smoke of the prairie townships hung horizontal in the cold. Heinrich fed the hay burner stove every 2 hours through the day and every 3 hours through the night. Margaretha tended the bread and the soup and the children. The soddy held at plus 50 at the floor for 2 days, then at plus 47 on the 3rd day, then at plus 45 on the 4th. The chips were burning faster than Heinrich had reckoned. The prolonged extreme cold had pulled more heat through the sod walls than the stockpile had allowed for. The 11 cords would carry to the middle of February, not the 2nd of March. On the morning of the 12th of January, the 7th hour past midnight, Heinrich heard a sound he did not understand. It was a small, hollow pop, then a slow, soft hiss, like the breath of a small kettle going cold. He rose from his pallet and walked to the stove in his stocking feet. The upper magazine of the pressed sheet steel had cracked along the welded seam from the hopper rim down to the draft band, and a thin column of pale gray smoke was rising from the crack into the soddy ceiling. The cheap sheet steel from the smithy of Heinrich Penner had given under 5 days of unbroken extreme heat. Heinrich stood at the stove in the dark soddy with the children sleeping behind him and his pregnant wife asleep in the bed and the temperature of the room beginning already to drop. He laid his hand on the cracked steel. He prayed under his breath in the Plaudietsch of his father. He woke Margaretha. He did not wake the children. He set Margaretha to feed the stove with whatever chips remained in the cabin while he went out into the lean-to at minus 42 with a candle lantern. He cut up an old lard tin with a hand shears and pried free 3 sections of clean tin from a broken wash tub. He brought them inside with frostbit hands. He worked the kitchen table from the 7th hour of the morning of the 12th through the 9th hour of the night of the 13th. He cut the salvaged tin with the hand shears to fit the cracked seam. He drilled small holes through the tin with the awl from his harness kit. He pinned the tin patch over the cracked seam with hand-cut iron rivets from the smithy bag. He sealed the rivet line with a flux of pine pitch and fine wood ash worked together to a paste. He let the patch cool. He fed the stove a fresh load of chips. The patch held. The stove burned. The soddy held at plus 45. Heinrich coughed once at the kitchen table when the work was done. It was a wet cough. Margaretha heard it. She set her hand on his back. His shirt under the woolen coat was soaked through. He had stayed in the lean-to at minus 42 for 2 long hours. She made him hot tea with the last of the honey. She put him to bed under 3 quilts. The patch stove burned. Heinrich slept. The patch held. He woke with a fever on the morning of the 14th. The fever was a slow climb. By the night of the 15th of January, it stood at 103 on the small mercury fever glass that Katharina Penner, the midwife, had loaned the family in the autumn. By the night of the 17th, it stood at 104, and Heinrich was not entirely with them. By the morning of the 19th, he could not walk to the stove, and Margaretha fed the stove herself every 2 hours through the day and every 3 hours through the night. Old Cornelius rode the 12 miles round trip to Hillsboro through a minus 25 morning to fetch Katharina Penner. Katharina came back the same afternoon in Cornelius's spring wagon under 3 buffalo robes. She listened at Heinrich's chest with a wooden trumpet. She said it was the lung fever. She said the chips and the soup and the goose fat compresses might carry him through, or might not. She prayed in Plaudietsch beside the bed. She said she would come back when the storm next broke. Margaretha tended Heinrich and the stove and the children together for 4 days alone after Katharina rode home. On the night of the 23rd of January, Heinrich was lucid for an hour. He took her hand. He spoke the words she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He spoke them in the Plaudietsch of his father's house. Du warst recht, Greta. You were right, Greta. He spoke once more in Plaudietsch. He said, Vergib mi mien Hochmut. Forgive me my pride. He said, Forgive me the humility I did not have. Margaretha bent her forehead to the back of his hand and wept quietly for an hour, with no sound, into the woolen quilt. Heinrich slept again. The fever did not break. The stove burned. The soddy held. Susanna asked her mother on the morning of the 24th of January if Papa would be well in time for the baby. Margaretha said, We will hope, child. Johann brought his great-grandfather's tin cup to Heinrich's pillow and set it there as a gift. Heinrich did not see it. Bernhard Wiebe of the Western Quarter Section heard from Pastor Ediger on the morning of the 28th of January that his younger brother was struck with the lung fever. Pastor Ediger had ridden the route from Cornelius's home, claimed to the Bernhard Wiebe place at dawn. The pastor stood on the threshold of the western soddy with his hat in his hand and gave the news. Bernhard's wife, Tina Jansen Wiebe, wept at the news. Bernhard saddled his bay mare in 20 minutes. He rode the 2 miles south by east through the cracked drifts on the section line and stood at the threshold of his brother's soddy in the 2nd hour of the afternoon. Margaretha opened the door. She saw who it was. She did not let him in at once. Bernhard stood with his black felt hat in his hand and his head bent. He said in Plautdeutsch, Greta, I have come. Margaretha said, Why did Pastor Ediger have to fetch you? "Why did you not come of your own accord?" Bernhard said, "Because I am the elder, and the elder forgets first. Because in our tongue, demut is the word that we have spoken every Sunday for 4 years, and not lived. Forgive me, Greta. Let me see my brother." Margaretha stood in the doorway 4 breaths longer. She stepped aside. She said, "Come in, Bernhard. He has been asking for you in his fever." Bernhard sat at his brother's bedside through the night. He laid the leather-bound Mennonite Gesangbuch open on Heinrich's chest and read aloud the 84th Psalm. He fed the stove every 3 hours. In the morning, he hauled in 2 armloads of mulberry from his own windbreak that he had brought tied to his saddle. He stoked the stove. He spoke quietly to Margaretha in the kitchen. He took Susanna and Johann home with him on his bay mare in 2 trips that evening to be cared for by his wife Tina until Heinrich turned the corner. Margaretha was alone with her husband and the unborn child after the 2nd of February. Margaretha tended Heinrich through the 8 days of February. The fever did not let go. He was lucid for short minutes in the mornings. He was not lucid in the afternoons. The stove held at +45 at the floor. The chips were running low. Bernhard rode over every other day with a fresh bundle of mulberry. He did not speak much. He did not need to. Margaretha went into labor on the morning of the 24th of February at the 7th hour past midnight. She was alone with her husband. The midwife, Katharina Penner, was 3 miles north, and the wind was at 30 miles an hour, and the porch thermometer read 17 below. There was no one she could call. She had laid the cradle of bent pine and the small linen quilt at the foot of the bed 3 weeks before. She labored for 19 hours. The labor was hard. She was a thin woman of 32 who had not slept a full night in 5 weeks. The child came at the 2nd hour past midnight on the 25th of February, a girl of 7 pounds with a strong cry and a clear eye. Margaretha cut the cord with the kitchen shears and tied it with linen thread from her own wedding tow. She wrapped the child in the small linen quilt and laid her on Heinrich's chest where he could feel her warmth. Heinrich opened his eyes for the first time in 2 days. He looked at the child. He laid his right hand on the child's head. He said in the Plauditsch of Schönfeld, "Helena. We name her Helena, after my mother, who passed in the year our first one passed. Helena Susanna Wiebe." Heinrich did not speak again. He took breath at long intervals through the rest of that day and the next. He passed quietly at 3 in the morning of the 27th of February, with his right hand still on the head of his daughter Helena. Margaretha laid him out on the kitchen table with the help of no one. She washed him with warm water from the kettle. She set the iron tinderbox that had been his father's on his chest, beneath his folded hands. The hay burner stove failed altogether on the morning of the 2nd of March. The patch that Heinrich had cut and riveted in the 7th hour of the 12th of January gave way at the lower edge. The chips were nearly gone. Margaretha could not lift the stoveplate to fit a fresh patch. She had no pine pitch. She had no rivets. She had no Heinrich. She wrapped Helena in the small linen quilt and tucked her against her own breast under the wool work dress. She wrapped Susanna in her own wool greatcoat. She wrapped Johann in his father's coat. She sat the 3 children on the warm bed quilts, and she fed the small banked coals every 20 minutes from a thin pile of last hay knots through the day and through the night. Bernhard had ridden west on the morning of the 2nd of March on parish business at Hillsboro, and was held by a fresh blow until the morning of the 5th. Margaretha sat by the bed of her 3 children through the night of the 3rd and through the day and night of the 4th. The cold breaking that came in on the morning of the 5th was the first warm wind out of the southwest in 17 weeks. The porch thermometer read +18 above zero at sunrise. The wind was light. The drifts were beginning to settle. She rose. She tucked the iron tinderbox of Heinrich's father into the chest pocket of her own apron beside the brass thimble of her mother. She tied Helena across her chest in a linen sling. She woke Susanna and Johann. She told them they were going to Opa's house. She told them the walk was 1.5 miles. She told them they would walk it together, holding on to her apron. She did not look back at the soddy. She took her 3 children north through the warming Kansas morning, between the tall snow-cleft drifts and the long banked windrows of frozen cattle that had gone down in the great freeze, and she walked. She passed 41 carcasses of long-horned cattle between her own threshold stone and the section line of her father's home claim. Susanna asked her once, "Mama, are they sleeping?" Margaretha said, "Yes, child, they sleep." Cornelius Toews opened the door of the home soddy at the 11th hour of the morning. He had been watching the south for 3 days. He took Helena from her mother's breast. Tina Wiebe took Susanna. Bernhard rose from the bench by the stove and bent his forehead to his sister-in-law's shoulder and stood there a long while without speaking. Pastor Ediger arrived at sunset and read from the Gesangbuch in Plautitsch. The 3 children slept. Helena slept on a folded wool quilt beside the warm iron stove. The brass thimble of Margaretha's mother sat on the kitchen windowsill, and it caught the last red of the prairie sunset, and it was the only red note in the room. The coffin in the granary was carried out on the morning of the 2nd of April, when the prairie ground had thawed enough for the spade. Heinrich Wiebe was laid in the small Krimmer Brethren burial ground at Gnadenau, beside his father Jakob and beside his first daughter Sarah. Bernhard stood at the head of the grave with his black felt hat in his hand. Margaretha stood at the foot with the newborn Helena bound to her chest, and Susanna and Johann holding the brass thimble pocket of her apron. Pastor Ediger read the 84th Psalm in Plautitsch. The 41 frozen carcasses of long-horned cattle had been hauled to the burn pit by the township road crew the week before. The prairie was beginning to green. A meadowlark sang once from the south fence rail. Margaretha lived to be 83 years of age. She raised Susanna and Johann and Helena. She taught Helena the use of the brass thimble, and Helena taught her own first daughter, and the brass thimble passed down through the family of the Wiebe Toews line into the hands of the great-great-granddaughter of Margaretha at Newton, Kansas, in spring of 1968. The iron tinderbox of Jacob Wiebe of Schoenfeld was donated to the Mennonite Heritage Center at Gössel in 1942. The hayburner stove pattern of Cornelius Toews was published in the Hillsboro Anzeiger in the autumn of 1887 and was built by 43 Mennonite households across Marion and Harvey counties in the year that followed. None of those 43 stoves cracked. The Hillsboro Anzeiger named the pattern the Wiebe pattern, after the man who had cut and riveted the salvaged lard tin patch in the 7th hour of the 12th of January of 1887, and whose patch had held 3 weeks past its hour, and whose pride had been the cold that had taken him in the end. Margaretha never remarried. She kept the brass thimble on her right thumb every evening of her life. She kept the schimmel on the windowsill of the Wiebe Toews farmhouse at the section line. She told her 3 children, when they were grown and asked her of their father, that he had been a man much loved, that he had been a man of quiet faith and loud pride, and that the cold of that great freeze had been a cold against which no soddy and no stove could in the end stand, but that the warmth of a brother coming through a doorway with a hat in his hand could stand against any cold the prairie could send. She is buried beside Heinrich at the Krimmer Brethren burial ground at Gnadenau. The brass thimble is buried with her. The schimmel stands on the windowsill of her great-great-granddaughter at Newton to this day.